The mountain man everyone called Ghost collapsed against the ice wall, gasping as frozen air tore through his lungs, and in that moment of desperate shelter-seeking, he pressed his hand against what he thought was solid rock, only to feel it give way, revealing a darkness that had been waiting 47 years to swallow someone whole. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The Colorado Rockies in January don't forgive mistakes. Jackson Cole knew that better than most. At 48 years old, with a beard that had gone more silver than black and hands scarred from decades of working with rock and metal, he'd learned to read the mountains the way other men read newspapers. Every shift in wind direction, every change in cloud formation, every subtle drop in temperature told him something. And today, they were all screaming the same warning: get to shelter or die. He'd been checking his trap lines, a routine he'd done hundreds of times over the past 6 years since he'd left civilization behind. The traps were mostly for rabbits and the occasional fox, enough to supplement the supplies he hauled up from the town of Redstone every few weeks. His cabin sat at 9,200 feet, tucked into a valley between two peaks that most maps didn't bother naming. It was remote enough that helicopter tours never flew overhead, and the nearest neighbor was 12 miles away as the crow flies, probably 25 on foot through the terrain. The storm had come faster than his weather radio predicted. He'd left the cabin at dawn under clear skies, the kind of crystalline blue morning that made the isolation feel like freedom instead of exile. By 10 o'clock, clouds had rolled in from the west, dark and heavy. By 11:30, the first flakes were falling. By noon, he couldn't see 15 feet in front of him. Jackson pulled his wool scarf tighter across his face and squinted into the whiteout. His cabin was still 3 miles north, but the visibility had deteriorated so badly that he'd already walked past 2 landmarks without seeing them. The temperature had dropped to what felt like 10 below zero, and with the wind chill, it was probably closer to 30 below. His fingers were going numb inside his gloves. He knew better than to panic. Panic killed people in the mountains faster than cold or hunger ever could. He stopped, forced himself to take 3 deep breaths, and assessed his situation with the methodical precision of the mining engineer he used to be. He had his pack with emergency supplies, fire starter, emergency blanket, water purification tablets, dried venison, a knife, rope, and his headlamp. He had maybe 4 hours of daylight left, though in this storm it barely mattered. And he had one major problem. If he kept moving in zero visibility, he'd walk right off a cliff or into a ravine. He needed shelter, and he needed it now. Jackson turned slowly, trying to orient himself. Through the driving snow, he could barely make out the dark shape of a rock face about 30 yards to his right. He didn't remember that formation from his mental map of the area, but in a whiteout, everything looked different. He trudged toward it, each step sinking 8 inches into fresh powder. As he got closer, the rock face revealed itself to be part of a larger cliff system, rising maybe 60 feet above him. The stone was dark granite, slick with ice, and utterly unforgiving. He moved along its base, one hand trailing against the frozen surface, looking for any kind of overhang or depression that might provide even minimal protection from the wind. That's when his hand sank into nothing. Jackson stopped, confused. He pulled his hand back and looked at the rock face. From straight on, it appeared solid. But when he shifted his angle, he could see it, a gap in the stone, maybe 3 feet wide, hidden by the way 2 sections of cliff face overlapped. It was like nature's optical illusion, invisible unless you were standing in exactly the right spot. He pulled out his flashlight and aimed the beam into the opening. The light disappeared into darkness. A cave. In his 6 years living up here, Jackson had explored dozens of caves and old mine shafts. Most were shallow, dead ends carved by ancient water flow or 19th century prospectors who gave up after hitting granite. But this one felt different. The opening was narrow, but beyond it, his light suggested a larger space. He glanced back at the storm. The wind was picking up and the temperature was still dropping. He could feel it in his bones, the kind of cold that started shutting down your body from the outside in. He had 2 choices: Try to push on toward his cabin and risk freezing to death in the open, or take shelter in this cave and wait out the worst of the storm. Jackson squeezed through the narrow opening. The temperature inside was immediately different, not warm, but protected from the wind, which made it feel 20 degrees warmer. He moved forward carefully, sweeping his flashlight across the space. The cave opened up quickly, expanding from that narrow entrance into a chamber roughly 15 feet wide and 12 feet high. The walls were covered in ice formations, icicles hanging from the ceiling like frozen chandeliers, and sheets of ice coating the stone in places where water had seeped and frozen over countless winters. But something was wrong. Jackson had been in enough caves to recognize natural ice formation, and this wasn't entirely natural. The ice on the walls was too uniform in places, too deliberately placed. And the cave itself went back farther than his light could reach, the darkness swallowing the beam after about 40 feet. He moved deeper, his boots crunching on the frozen floor. The cave bent slightly to the left, and as he rounded that bend, he stopped dead. There were tool marks on the walls. Not natural erosion, but deliberate cuts made by picks and chisels. And on the ground, partially buried in ice, were pieces of old equipment, a rusted pulley system, coils of ancient rope that crumbled at his touch, and what looked like parts of a minecart track. This wasn't just a cave. It was a mine shaft, or had been at some point. But it was unlike any mine entrance Jackson had ever seen. There were no support timbers, no formal entrance structure, no tailings pile outside. Whoever had worked here had wanted it hidden. His engineer's mind started calculating. Based on the tool marks and equipment style, he'd guess this was late 19th century, maybe early 20th. Redstone had been a mining town back then, silver and coal mostly, but there were always rumors of smaller operations, independent prospectors who kept their finds secret to avoid claim jumpers or taxation. Jackson moved deeper into the shaft. The air was getting colder again, that deep underground cold that settled into your lungs. After another 20 feet, the passage opened into a second, larger chamber. This one was maybe 25 feet across, with a ceiling that rose up into darkness beyond his light's reach. And that's when he saw it. On the far wall, barely visible under a thick coating of ice, was a metal door. Jackson approached slowly, his heart rate picking up. The door was industrial, made of heavy steel with rivets along the edges. It looked like something from a bank vault or a military installation, completely out of place in a mountain cave. The ice covering it was at least 6 inches thick in places, built up over decades of seeping water and freezing temperatures. He set down his pack and pulled out his knife, using the handle to chip away at the ice. It came off in sheets, revealing more of the door beneath. There was a wheel lock in the center, the kind you'd spin to operate internal bolts, and stenciled on the door in faded paint, barely legible, were 2 words: private property. The storm outside howled louder, reminding Jackson why he was here. He should set up his emergency shelter, start a small fire, wait out the blizzard. That was the smart move, the safe move. But he couldn't stop staring at that door. He spent the next hour working on the ice, using his knife and a small camping shovel from his pack to chip and scrape. His emergency fire starter helped. He lit small fragments of dried wood and held them against the ice, melting it faster than chipping alone could manage. The work warmed him up, which was good because the temperature in the cave had to be close to 0. Finally, he cleared enough ice to access the wheel lock. He grabbed it with both hands and pulled. Nothing. He tried pushing. Still nothing. The mechanism was frozen solid, probably rusted shut even without the ice. Jackson sat back on his heels, thinking. In his pack, he had rope, a knife, some basic climbing equipment, and his fire-starting supplies. Not exactly a locksmith's toolkit, but he did have something else. Knowledge. He'd spent 23 years as a mining engineer before everything fell apart. He knew about vault doors, about pressure systems and mechanical locks. He examined the door more carefully. The wheel lock operated bolts that would slide into the surrounding rock. If he could generate enough heat to expand the metal, the ice inside the mechanism might melt and the rust might loosen just enough to turn. He gathered all his fire-starting materials, the cotton balls soaked in petroleum jelly, the small bundle of fatwood he always carried, and even some of the old rope from the mine equipment that was dry enough to burn. He built a careful fire right up against the door's wheel mechanism, feeding it slowly to keep the heat concentrated. While the fire worked, Jackson explored the rest of the chamber. In the far corner, he found more equipment. Old crates stamped with dates from 1976, a camping lantern that still had dried fuel in it and something that made him stop cold, a leather journal sealed in a waterproof canvas bag. He opened the bag carefully. The journal was remarkably well preserved, its leather cover stiff but intact. He opened to the first page and read the name written there in careful script. Vincent Hartley, April 5, 1976. Jackson knew that name. Everyone in Redstone knew that name, even newcomers like him who'd only been around 6 years. Vincent Hartley was local legend, the mining company owner who'd disappeared in the spring of 1976, taking with him the entire pension fund of his 140 workers. The theft had destroyed families, bankrupted the town, and sparked a manhunt that lasted years. They'd never found Hartley, never recovered the money, and eventually the case went cold. Jackson flipped through the journal, his hands trembling slightly. The entries were dated, starting in March of 1976 and continuing through early June of that same year. He read random passages, his eyes widening with each page. March 14th. The guilt is eating me alive, but I can't see another way. The company is bankrupt. If I don't take the pension fund, we lose everything. I tell myself I'll pay it back, that this is just a loan, but I know the truth. April 20th. I've moved everything to the cave. Gold, cash, bonds, everything I could liquidate. No one knows about this place. My grandfather found it in 1903 but never registered the claim. He used it to hide silver during the panics. Now it's my turn to hide from what I've done. May 7th. I can't go back. They're looking for me. I see my face on wanted posters in the Denver papers. What have I become? I was supposed to take care of these people, and instead, I've destroyed them. Jackson looked up from the journal, staring at the door with new understanding. Behind that steel barrier was Vincent Hartley's hiding place, the stolen pension fund, money that belonged to families who'd lost everything 47 years ago. His fire had burned down to coals, but the metal of the wheel lock was warm to the touch now. He grabbed it again, putting his full weight into turning it clockwise. It moved. Just a quarter inch at first, then more. The wheel groaned and shrieked, metal grinding against metal, but it turned. Jackson kept working it back and forth, loosening decades of rust and ice. After 10 minutes of effort, the wheel completed a full rotation, then another. On the third rotation, he heard something inside the door shift, heavy bolts sliding back. He pulled the door handle. The door swung open with a sound like a tomb exhaling. Behind it was a room. Not a natural cave formation, but a carved-out space, roughly 12 feet by 15 feet, with walls that had been reinforced with timbers and concrete. And filling that space, stacked neatly on wooden pallets, were metal boxes. Jackson stepped inside, his flashlight beam sweeping across the contents. He opened the first box with shaking hands. Gold bars, stamped with dates from the 1970s, each one roughly the size of a brick. He counted 20 in the first box. The second box held more gold, along with what looked like rare coins in protective sleeves. The third box was filled with bearer bonds, financial instruments that belonged to whoever held them, impossible to trace, and each one worth thousands. Jackson moved through the room in a daze, opening box after box. There were documents, too, property deeds, stock certificates, and bundles of cash that had somehow stayed dry in sealed containers. Some of the bills were old enough to be collectible on their own. In the back corner, he found something else. A smaller box, wooden instead of metal, with "Open Last" carved into its lid. Inside was another journal entry, this one written on a single sheet of paper, the handwriting shaky and desperate. June 9th, 1976. If you're reading this, then I didn't make it. The chest pains have been getting worse. I think my heart is giving out, which is fitting since I clearly never had one to begin with. I've spent 3 months in this cave, hiding from what I did, and all I've accomplished is turning myself into a corpse with a treasure map. The money is yours now, whoever you are. Do what I couldn't. Give it back. Every penny came from people who earned it with their hands and their sweat. I stole their futures. Maybe you can return them. Vincent Hartley. Jackson sat down hard on one of the crates, the paper still in his hand. The journal had said June 9th. He looked around the room with new eyes, noticing details he'd missed before. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a sleeping bag. And inside that sleeping bag was something that made Jackson's stomach turn. Bones, a skeleton, still dressed in the rotted remains of a 1970s suit, a wallet visible in what used to be the jacket pocket. Vincent Hartley had died here, alone in the dark, surrounded by the fortune he'd stolen. Jackson stood up slowly and approached the remains. He didn't want to, but he needed to know. He carefully removed the wallet, opening it to find a driver's license behind cracked plastic. The photo showed a man in his 50s with thinning hair and tired eyes. Vincent Alexander Hartley. Date of birth, March 3rd, 1923. That would have made him 53 when he died. Jackson looked around the room again, doing rough calculations in his head. Based on the gold alone, this was worth millions. Add in the bonds, the rare coins, and the collectible currency, and the total value could easily reach. He stopped himself. The exact number didn't matter. What mattered was what this represented: the life savings and pensions of 140 families. Retirements that never happened. College funds that evaporated. Futures stolen by one man's desperation and greed. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Jackson checked his watch. 3:45 in the afternoon. The blizzard would likely continue through the night. He was stuck here until morning at the earliest, trapped in a tomb with a fortune and a corpse. He moved back to the main chamber, away from the vault room, and set up his emergency camp. He got a proper fire going, using some of the old timber from the mine equipment as fuel. The smoke would vent through the cave system. He could feel a slight draft, which meant there was airflow somewhere above. As the fire warmed the space and his frozen hands started to ache with returning circulation, Jackson pulled out the journal again and read it cover to cover. It told the story of a man who'd made one terrible choice and then compounded it with pride, fear, and isolation. Hartley had convinced himself he could hide until things blew over, that eventually he could sneak back into society and maybe even return the money without facing consequences. But the isolation had broken him. The journal entries grew more erratic as the weeks passed. Hartley wrote about hearing voices, seeing shadows, wondering if God could forgive theft if you died before you could make it right. The final dated entry was from June 8th, the day before the note in the wooden box. It simply said, "I can't feel my left arm. This is it. This is what I deserve." Jackson closed the journal and stared into the fire. He thought about the past 6 years of his own life, the reason he'd fled to these mountains. His wife, Rebecca, had died of cancer when he was 42. They'd been married 19 years, and her death had cracked something fundamental inside him. He'd tried to keep working, tried to maintain his life in Denver, but everything reminded him of her. The engineering firm where they'd met, the restaurants where they'd celebrated anniversaries, the parks where they'd talked about growing old together. So he'd run, sold everything, bought this isolated piece of land, and built a cabin where he could be alone with his grief. For 6 years, he'd told himself he was healing, finding peace in solitude. But sitting in this cave, reading about a man who'd isolated himself into madness and death, Jackson wondered if he'd been doing the same thing. Different reasons, different circumstances, but the same fundamental mistake, trying to outrun pain by running away from people. He pulled out his satellite phone, one of his few concessions to safety. No signal, as expected. The storm was too heavy, and he was too deep in the mountain. But tomorrow, when the storm cleared, he'd have to make a choice. He could walk away, take a few gold bars, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life, and leave the rest to rot with Hartley's bones. No one knew about this place. He could reseal the door, cover his tracks, and the secret would die with him someday. Or he could do what Hartley had asked in his final note. Give it back. Report the find, deal with the authorities and the media circus, and try to return this stolen fortune to the people it had been taken from, or their children, or their grandchildren. Jackson fed another piece of timber to the fire and thought about the families in Redstone. In his 6 years there, he'd kept mostly to himself, but he knew the town's history. He knew there were still people living there who'd grown up poor because of what Hartley did. He'd met an old woman named Dorothy Finch once at the general store. She'd been friendly, tried to make conversation despite his obvious desire to be left alone. Later, the store owner mentioned that Dorothy's husband had worked for Hartley Mining, that they'd lost everything in '76, that her husband had died young from the stress of trying to rebuild their lives. What would it mean to those families to finally get justice? Not just the money, though that would matter, but the knowledge that the truth had come out, that their pain had been acknowledged, that someone had chosen to do the right thing even when it would have been easier to do nothing. Jackson didn't sleep much that night. He kept the fire going, listening to the storm howl outside and thinking about choices, consequences, and whether redemption was something you could give someone else or only find for yourself. By morning, the storm had passed. Jackson emerged from the cave into a world transformed by snow, everything white and pure and unmarked. The sky was that impossible blue that only comes after a blizzard has scrubbed the air clean. He stood at the cave entrance, looking down at the valley below where somewhere beyond his view the town of Redstone was waking up. He thought about Vincent Hartley, dying alone with his guilt. He thought about Rebecca, who'd always seen the best in people, who'd chosen compassion over judgment every single time. And he thought about who he wanted to be, a man hiding from life in these mountains, or a man who still believed some things were worth facing the world for. Jackson pulled out his satellite phone. This time, with clear skies, he had a signal. He stared at the screen for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the buttons. Then he made the call. The lawyer's voice on the other end of the satellite phone sounded skeptical, maybe even annoyed at being called at 7:30 in the morning. Jackson didn't blame him. What he was saying sounded insane even to his own ears. "Let me get this straight," the lawyer said slowly. "You're calling from a cave in the mountains to tell me you found Vincent Hartley's body and the stolen pension fund from 1976. "That's right," Jackson said, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. "And you want to turn it all in?" "Yes." A long pause. "Mr. Cole, I'm going to be honest with you. I get calls like this maybe twice a year. Treasure hunters, conspiracy theorists, people who think they've found Jimmy Hoffa or D.B. Cooper or whatever. It's always nothing." "This isn't nothing," Jackson said quietly. "I've got photos. I've got Hartley's journal. I've got his body with his driver's license still in his wallet. And I've got approximately $312 million in gold, bonds, and collectible currency sitting in a sealed vault." Another pause, longer this time. $312 million? Rough estimate based on current gold prices and what I could see on the bearer bonds. Could be more. The lawyer's tone changed. "Don't touch anything else. Don't tell anyone else. Give me your exact coordinates and I'll have people there by this afternoon. My name is David Rosen. I'm going to connect you with the FBI field office in Denver, and you're going to tell them exactly what you told me. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Good. And, Mr. Cole, if this is real, you just made the most expensive phone call in Colorado history." By noon, Jackson had been on the phone with 6 different people: FBI agents, a representative from the state attorney general's office, a forensic specialist, and 2 more lawyers. He'd given his coordinates, described the cave entrance, and sent over 100 photos from his digital camera via a painstakingly slow satellite upload. He'd also hiked back to his cabin, fed his dog, a 3-year-old mutt named Ranger he'd rescued from the Redstone Animal Shelter, and packed a larger bag. He had a feeling he wouldn't be sleeping in his own bed for a while. By 2 o'clock, he heard the helicopters. 2 of them appeared over the ridgeline, black and official-looking, with federal markings on the sides. They couldn't land at the cave. The terrain was too rough, but they set down in a clearing about a quarter-mile away. Jackson watched from the cave entrance as a team of 12 people hiked toward him, carrying equipment cases and looking simultaneously excited and skeptical. The lead agent was a woman in her 40s named Sarah Chen. She had sharp eyes and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from years of dealing with both legitimate cases and wild goose chases. She shook Jackson's hand firmly, studying his face like she was trying to read him. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I'm Special Agent Chen. Before we go any further, I need to ask you some questions." "All right. Have you removed anything from the cave?" "No, ma'am." "Have you told anyone else about this discovery?" "Just the people I called this morning." "How did you find the cave?" Jackson explained about the storm, the shelter-seeking, the hidden entrance. Agent Chen listened without interrupting, her expression neutral. "And you're absolutely certain the remains are Vincent Hartley's?" "Driver's license matches his face, name, and date of birth. Journal entries match the timeline of his disappearance, and the amount of wealth in that vault matches what was reported stolen." Agent Chen nodded slowly. "All right, show us." Jackson led them through the narrow entrance, into the main chamber, and finally to the steel door. He'd left it open, and the vault room beyond was visible in the beam of their high-powered lights. The federal team stood at the threshold in silence, staring at the stacks of metal boxes and wooden crates. One of the agents, a younger man with red hair, whispered, "Holy shit." Agent Chen shot him a look, then stepped into the vault. She moved methodically, examining boxes without touching them, taking photos, speaking quietly into a small recording device. When she reached the corner where Hartley's skeleton lay in its sleeping bag, she knelt down for a long moment, just looking. Finally, she stood and walked back to where Jackson waited at the door. Her expression had changed. The skepticism was gone, replaced by something like awe mixed with sadness. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly, "I've been with the Bureau for 22 years. I've worked fraud cases, organized crime, public corruption. I've seen a lot of money change hands in a lot of ugly ways. But I have never seen anything like this." "So it's real?" one of the other agents asked. "It's real," Agent Chen confirmed. "We're going to need to secure this site, catalog everything, verify the authenticity of the bonds and currency, and coordinate with about 15 different agencies. Mr. Cole, you're going to need to come with us and give a full statement. This is going to take months to sort out." "I understand," Jackson said. "I also need you to understand something else," Agent Chen continued. "Under federal law, you're entitled to a finder's fee. It varies depending on the circumstances, but for something of this magnitude, you could be looking at anywhere from 10 to 25% of the recovered value." Jackson did the math in his head. Even at 10%, that was over $30 million. "I don't want it," he said. The agents all turned to look at him. "Excuse me," Agent Chen said. "I don't want a finder's fee. This money was stolen from working people. It should go back to them or their families." Agent Chen studied him for a long moment. "Mr. Cole, I appreciate the sentiment, but you should think carefully about this. Talk to a lawyer. That's a life-changing amount of money." "I've already thought about it," Jackson said. "I made my decision before I called anyone this morning. I'm not interested in profiting from someone else's theft." One of the other agents, an older man with gray at his temples, spoke up. "Son, people don't turn down $30 million. Jackson met his eyes. "This one does." The recovery operation took 3 days. They brought in more helicopters, a team of forensic accountants, specialists in historical currency, and enough federal agents to populate a small town. They catalogued every bar of gold, every bond, every piece of paper. They carefully removed Hartley's remains and began the process of formal identification. And they documented everything with the kind of thoroughness that only federal investigations can manage. Jackson stayed at a hotel in Redstone that the FBI paid for, giving statements, answering questions, and repeating his story to various officials. By the evening of the 3rd day, the preliminary count was in. $347 million. That was the current estimated value of everything in the vault, accounting for the appreciation of gold prices since 1976, the collectible value of the old currency, and the face value of the bearer bonds. The actual amount stolen in 1976 had been approximately 18 million, the pension fund plus Hartley's liquidated personal assets. Time and careful preservation had multiplied it nearly 20-fold. David Rosen, the lawyer Jackson had first called, met him at the hotel restaurant that evening. Rosen was in his 60s, with grey hair and the kind of expensive suit that whispered rather than shouted wealth. He sat down across from Jackson and ordered a whiskey before speaking. "You're either the most principled man I've ever met," Rosen said, "or the most foolish." "Maybe both," Jackson replied. "The FBI confirmed your decision to waive the finder's fee. That's legally binding now. You understand you just walked away from approximately $35 to $87 million, depending on how the final valuation shakes out?" "I understand." Rosen sipped his whiskey. "Mind if I ask why?" Jackson was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "My wife died 6 years ago. Cancer. We had good insurance, but it wasn't enough. The treatments that might have saved her, the experimental stuff, we couldn't afford it. We had savings, but not that kind of savings. She died at 40, and I've spent every day since wondering if things would have been different if we'd just had more money." He paused, looking down at his calloused hands. "But the thing is, Hartley had money. He had more money than most people see in a lifetime, and it didn't save him. It didn't make him happy. It didn't give him peace. He died alone in a cave, drowning in guilt, with a fortune he couldn't spend and couldn't return. So what's the point? What's money worth if you have to become someone you hate to keep it?" Rosen was quiet for a long time. Then he raised his glass. "To principle," he said. "May it never go out of fashion." They drank in silence. The news broke on the 4th day. Someone leaked it, maybe one of the agents, maybe someone at the Attorney General's office, and by morning, every major news outlet in the country was running the story. Missing fortune found after 47 years. Mountain man discovers 300 million in stolen pension fund. Hermit refuses reward, chooses justice. Jackson's phone, which he'd turned back on for the first time in days, immediately exploded with calls and messages. Reporters, producers, distant relatives he hadn't spoken to in years, investment advisors, and people claiming to be descendants of Hartley's victims. He turned it off again after 10 minutes. Agent Chen called on the hotel's landline. "Mr. Cole, we need to talk about security." "Security? You just became one of the most famous people in America. And you're also the man who knows exactly where $347 million is located. We've already intercepted 2 separate groups of treasure hunters trying to get to the cave. One of them had climbing gear and weapons. We need to relocate you to a secure location until this calms down." "For how long?" "Honestly, I don't know. This story has legs. It's got everything the media loves. Hidden treasure, a decades-old mystery, a humble hero who turns down a fortune. You're going to be news for a while." Jackson closed his eyes. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid by moving to the mountains 6 years ago. Attention, scrutiny, people. "What about the families?" he asked. "The people Hartley stole from?" "We're working on that," Agent Chen said. "We've got a team tracking down the original victims or their descendants. It's complicated. 140 people lost money in 1976. Some of them are dead. Some have moved away. Some might have passed away without heirs. But we're doing our best to find everyone who has a legitimate claim." "How long will that take?" "Months. Maybe a year. These things don't move fast." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, you lay low, stay safe, and try not to get yourself killed by treasure hunters or scam artists." They moved Jackson to a safe house outside of Colorado Springs, a nondescript ranch home in a gated community with 24-hour security. He was allowed to bring Ranger, which was the only thing that made the situation bearable. For 2 weeks, he lived in a kind of surreal isolation, watching himself become a media sensation while sitting in a borrowed house eating takeout. The stories multiplied. Some were accurate, some were wildly embellished. He read articles calling him a hero, a fool, a saint, and a publicity seeker. There were conspiracy theories about whether the treasure was really Hartley's or something more sinister. There were opinion pieces debating whether he should have taken the finder's fee. There were even a few think pieces about what his decisions said about American values in the 21st century. Through it all, Jackson just felt tired. On day 16, David Rosen visited with news. "They've found 83 of the original victims or their descendants," he said. "Another 22 are confirmed deceased with no heirs. The rest they're still tracking down." 83, Jackson repeated. "That's a lot of people." "It is, and they want to meet you." Jackson looked up sharply. "What?" "There's a town hall meeting scheduled in Redstone for next week. The families want to see you. Thank you. Hear the story firsthand. The FBI thinks it's a good idea. Helps with the investigation, puts faces to the victims. Good PR for everyone involved." "I don't want PR," Jackson said. "I know, but these people deserve closure, and you're part of that story now, whether you like it or not." Jackson stood and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn and the fence beyond. Ranger followed, pressing against his leg the way he did when he sensed anxiety. "What if I say no?" Jackson asked quietly. "Then they'll be hurt. They'll wonder why the man who found their stolen money won't face them, and honestly, I think it would be a mistake. These people have been waiting 47 years for answers. You can give them that." Jackson thought about Dorothy Finch, the old woman from the general store. Somewhere out there, she was probably one of the 83. Probably wondering if the money that destroyed her husband would finally come back to her in her final years. "All right," he said. "I'll do it." The town hall was held in the Redstone Community Center, a building that had seen better days but still stood proud at the center of town. Jackson arrived early, escorted by 2 federal agents who looked uncomfortable in their suits. David Rosen walked beside him, briefing him on what to expect. "There will be media," Rosen said. "We couldn't keep them out, but they're restricted to the back of the room and they can't approach you directly. The families will be up front. Agent Chen will moderate. Just be honest, be yourself, and remember, these people are grateful, not angry." Jackson wasn't sure he believed that last part. They entered through a side door. The room was already full, maybe 200 people packed into a space designed for half that. The front rows were filled with older folks, people in their 60s and 70s, some with walkers, some holding hands with younger family members who must have been children or grandchildren. In the back, cameras and reporters jostled for position. Agent Chen stood at a podium, speaking quietly with a woman Jackson didn't recognize. When she saw him enter, she nodded and gestured for him to sit in a chair on the stage. Jackson walked up the 3 steps to the platform, feeling like a man heading to his own execution. He sat down, and the room went quiet. Agent Chen stepped to the microphone. "Thank you all for coming. I'm Special Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI. As you know, we're here today because of a discovery made 3 weeks ago by Mr. Jackson Cole. Before we begin, I want to set some ground rules. This is not a press conference. The media may observe, but they will not participate. This meeting is for the families affected by Vincent Hartley's theft in 1976. Mr. Cole has agreed to speak with you and answer your questions. Please be respectful." She turned to Jackson. "Mr. Cole, would you like to start by telling everyone how you found the cave?" Jackson stood and moved to the microphone. His hands were shaking slightly, but he gripped the sides of the podium and steadied himself. He looked out at the faces staring up at him. Old faces, mostly, marked by years of struggle and survival. "I'm not good at public speaking," he began, his voice rough. "I've spent the last 6 years avoiding people, so this is about as comfortable for me as standing naked in a snowstorm." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. He saw some of the tension ease. "I found the cave by accident," he continued. "I was checking trap lines when a blizzard hit. I needed shelter, or I was going to freeze to death. I saw what looked like a rock face, found a gap, squeezed through. Inside was a mine shaft, and at the end of that shaft was a steel door." He described the ice, the wheel lock, the hours of work to get it open. He described the vault room and what he found inside. He described Vincent Hartley's skeleton and the journal entries that told the story of a man destroyed by his own choices. He wrote a note, Jackson said, pulling the paper from his pocket. He'd brought the original, sealed in plastic by the FBI, but returned to him for this moment. He wrote it the day before he died. It says, "The money is yours now, whoever you are. Do what I couldn't. Give it back." Jackson looked up from the paper. "So that's what I'm trying to do. Give it back. This money belongs to you and your families. It always did." The room was silent for a long moment. Then an old man in the second row stood up slowly, using a cane for support. He had thick glasses and liver spots on his hands, but his voice was clear. "My name is Robert Torres," he said. "I worked for Hartley Mining for 31 years. I was 52 when he stole our pensions. I'm 99 now. I spent the last 47 years thinking I'd die before anyone found that bastard or the money he took." His voice cracked. "Young man, you just gave me something I never thought I'd have. Justice. Thank you doesn't even begin to cover it." He sat down and the woman next to him, probably his daughter, put her arm around him as he wept. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Another person stood, then another. One by one, they introduced themselves and told their stories. A woman named Patricia, whose father had a heart attack the year after the theft and whose mother always blamed the stress. A man named Marcus, who grew up in poverty because his parents lost everything. A younger woman, maybe 40, who'd never met her grandfather, but knew he died bitter and broken because of what Hartley did. They didn't just thank Jackson. They told him what the money would mean. Medical bills paid, grandchildren's college funds established, houses that could finally be repaired or paid off, retirements that might actually include some comfort instead of just survival. Jackson listened to each one, his throat getting tighter with every story. These weren't abstract victims. They were real people whose lives had been shaped by one man's theft and another man's guilt. Finally, an old woman in the third row stood up. Jackson recognized her immediately. Dorothy Finch, from the general store. She was smaller than he remembered, more fragile, with white hair and hands that trembled as she gripped her walker. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You probably don't remember me, but we met once. I tried to chat with you at Thompson's, and you were polite but clearly wanted to be left alone." Jackson felt his face flush. "I remember, Ma'am. I'm sorry I was rude." She smiled. "You weren't rude, dear. You were grieving. I recognized it because I've been there. My husband, Thomas, he worked for Hartley. We lost our pension, our savings, everything. Thomas tried to start over, but the stress broke him. He died of a stroke at 63. I've lived the last 34 years alone, working whatever jobs I could find, getting by on Social Security and the kindness of neighbors." She paused, tears streaming down her face. "I'm 87 years old. I never thought I'd see a penny of that money again. I'd made my peace with it. But you," her voice broke, "you gave up millions of dollars to do the right thing. You restored something I thought was gone forever. My faith that good people still exist." Jackson couldn't speak. His own eyes were burning, and his vision was blurring. Dorothy continued, "So I want you to know something. You say you've been hiding in those mountains for 6 years, running from pain and people. But maybe God put you in that storm and led you to that cave because you were the right person to find it. Maybe your pain made you understand ours, and maybe, just maybe, you needed to find it as much as we needed you to." She sat down slowly, and the room erupted in applause. People were standing, crying, clapping. Jackson stood frozen at the podium, completely overwhelmed. Agent Chen let it go on for a full minute before calling for quiet. "Are there any questions for Mr. Cole?" A younger man raised his hand. "What will you do now?" Jackson thought about his cabin, his isolation, the 6 years of hiding. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I need to figure out how to live with people again." An older woman asked, Why did you really turn down the finder's fee? Most people would have taken it. Because it wasn't mine, Jackson said simply. And because I've learned that having money when you hate who you are is worse than being poor and being able to look at yourself in the mirror. More questions came. Where exactly was the cave? Would it become a tourist site? What happened to Hartley's body? How did it feel to make the discovery? Jackson answered as honestly as he could, though some details he couldn't share due to the ongoing investigation. Finally, Agent Chen called time. We need to wrap up. Mr. Cole needs to rest, and we have more work to do processing the claims. But I want to say something before we close. She turned to face Jackson directly. I've been with the FBI for 22 years. I've seen people lie, cheat, and steal in ways you wouldn't believe. I've seen corruption at every level of society, and I've become, I'll admit, somewhat cynical about human nature. She paused. But every now and then I meet someone who reminds me why I do this job. Someone who makes me believe that integrity still matters, that there are still people who will do the right thing even when it costs them everything. Mr. Cole, you're one of those people. Thank you for your honesty, your courage, and your decency. The room erupted in applause again. Jackson nodded, unable to trust his voice, and stepped away from the podium. As people filed out, many stopped to shake his hand or hug him. Dorothy Finch waited until the crowd thinned, then approached with her walker. Mr. Cole, she said quietly, would you do me a favor? Of course, ma'am. Stop hiding. The world needs people like you in it, not tucked away in the mountains where no one can find them. Jackson looked down at this tiny, fierce woman who'd survived decades of hardship and somehow maintained her kindness. I'll try, he said. That's all any of us can do, dear. That's all any of us can do. That night, back at the safe house, Jackson sat on the couch with Ranger's head in his lap and thought about everything Dorothy had said. Maybe she was right. Maybe the cave hadn't been random chance. Maybe he'd needed to find something bigger than his grief, something that reminded him that other people's pain mattered too. He pulled out his phone and for the first time in 6 years called his sister in Kansas. She answered on the third ring, her voice shocked. Jack, is that really you? Yeah, Sarah, it's me. I'm sorry I've been gone so long. I saw you on the news. The whole family did. We've been trying to reach you. I know, I'm sorry. I needed time. And now? Jackson looked around the safe house, thinking about his cabin, his isolation, the life he'd built that wasn't really a life at all. Now I think maybe I've had enough time alone. His sister was quiet for a moment. Then she said, There's always a room here if you need one. The kids would love to see their uncle again. I'd like that, Jackson said, and realized he meant it. They talked for an hour, catching up on 6 years of missed birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments. When they finally hung up, Jackson felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Connected. Over the next week, the legal machinery began to turn. The FBI completed its authentication of the recovered items. The State Attorney General's office established a trust fund to distribute the money to verified victims and heirs. Forensic accountants calculated each person's portion based on their original pension contributions and years of service. The estimated payout per victim varied, but most would receive between $2 and $4 million. For families like Dorothy's, who'd spent 47 years struggling, it was life-changing. Not just the money, but the acknowledgement, the proof that what happened to them mattered. David Rosen kept Jackson updated on the progress. They're moving faster than I expected, he said during one of their calls. Usually something like this would take 3 to 5 years to resolve. But I think there's political pressure to get this done right and done quickly. Nobody wants to be seen as the person holding up justice for 99-year-old pension victims. When will they actually get the money? Jackson asked. Probably 6 to 8 months. There are still legal hoops to jump through, tax implications to sort out, fraud prevention measures to implement, but it'll happen. Good. There's something else, Rosen said. The town of Redstone wants to give you something. I don't want anything. It's not money. It's a key to the town. Ceremonial. They want to do it at a special council meeting next month. Jackson sighed. Do I have to? No. But I think you should. These people want to honor you, and you shouldn't rob them of that chance. So a month later, Jackson found himself standing in front of the Redstone Town Council, accepting a brass key mounted on a wooden plaque. The mayor, a woman named Linda Ortiz, made a speech about integrity and sacrifice. The council members shook his hand. A local newspaper photographer took pictures. Afterward, at the reception, Dorothy Finch approached him again. I hear you're thinking of leaving the mountains, she said. How did you know that? She smiled. Small town, dear. People talk, are you? Jackson nodded slowly. I think so. I've been up there for 6 years, and I'm not sure it's done me any good. Maybe it's time to try something different. Where will you go? My sister's in Kansas. She's got a family, grandkids. I thought maybe I'd visit for a while, figure things out. Dorothy patted his hand. That sounds lovely. But I hope you'll come back and visit us sometime. You're part of this town's story now, whether you plan to be or not. I will, Jackson promised. And he meant it. 3 weeks later, Jackson stood in his cabin for the last time, packing the essentials and leaving the rest. He'd sold the property to a young couple from Denver who wanted to try the off-grid lifestyle. He hoped they'd have better luck with it than he had. Ranger watched from the doorway, tail wagging uncertainly. He could sense the change coming. It's all right, boy, Jackson said, scratching behind his ears. We're going somewhere with more people and fewer blizzards. He took one last look around the cabin. The wood stove he'd installed, the shelves he'd built, the window where he'd watched 6 winters pass in solitude. This place had been his refuge, his isolation, his prison. It had kept him safe from the pain of the world, but it had also kept him from living. He locked the door, loaded Ranger into his truck, and started driving down the mountain. In his rearview mirror, he watched the cabin disappear behind the trees, getting smaller and smaller until it was gone. He wasn't running anymore. For the first time in 6 years, Jackson Cole was heading towards something instead of away from it. And even though the future was uncertain, even though he didn't know exactly what came next, he felt something he hadn't felt since Rebecca died. He felt ready. The drive to Kansas took 2 days. Jackson stopped at cheap motels along the way, places where Ranger was welcome and the questions were few. He'd forgotten what it was like to be around people constantly, the hum of traffic on highways, the chatter in restaurant parking lots, the endless scroll of gas stations and strip malls that marked the landscape between Colorado and the flat plains of Kansas. His sister Sarah lived outside of Wichita, in a suburb that looked like every other suburb Jackson had ever seen. Neat houses with manicured lawns, minivans in driveways, basketball hoops over garage doors. He pulled up to her address just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him of the mountains he'd left behind. Sarah came running out before he'd even turned off the engine. She was 51 now, 3 years older than him, with grey streaking through her brown hair and laugh lines around her eyes that he didn't remember from 6 years ago. She pulled open his door and hugged him so hard he couldn't breathe. "You're really here," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I was afraid you'd change your mind." "I almost did," Jackson admitted, "about 5 times. She pulled back and looked at him, really looked at him, the way only a sister could. "You look terrible." "Thanks. I mean it. You look like you've been living in a cave." "Close enough." Her husband, Tom, appeared on the porch with 2 teenagers hovering behind him, Jackson's nephew and niece, who'd been 11 and 9 the last time he saw them. They were 17 and 15 now, practically strangers. The awkwardness of the reunion lasted through dinner, a hastily assembled meal of grilled chicken and pasta that Sarah kept apologizing for, even though it was fine. The kids, Michael and Emma, kept stealing glances at Jackson like he was some kind of exotic animal that had wandered into their suburban habitat. Finally, Emma, the younger one, spoke up. "Uncle Jack, is it true you found $300 million? "Emma!" Sarah said sharply. "It's okay," Jackson said. He looked at his niece, seeing genuine curiosity in her eyes rather than judgment. Yes, it's true. And you gave it all away. It wasn't mine to keep. But you could have kept some of it, right? Like legally? Jackson nodded. I could have, I chose not to. Michael, the older one, leaned forward. Why? That's insane. You could have been set for life. Maybe, Jackson said. Or maybe I would have ended up like Vincent Hartley, dying alone in a cave with money I couldn't spend and guilt I couldn't escape. The table went quiet. Sarah gave him a look that was part gratitude and part concern. After dinner, once the kids had disappeared to their rooms and Tom had excused himself to watch television, Sarah and Jackson sat on the back porch with coffee. The night was warm, humid in a way the mountains never were, and the sound of crickets filled the air. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, Sarah said carefully. But I need to know. Are you okay? Jackson thought about the question for a long time. I don't know, he finally said. I spent 6 years telling myself I was okay, that I was healing, that being alone was what I needed. But I'm starting to think I was just hiding. From what? From everything. From pain, from people, from the fact that Rebecca is gone and she's never coming back. His voice cracked on his wife's name. I thought if I could just get far enough away from everything that reminded me of her, I'd stop hurting. But it didn't work. I just ended up lonely and broken in a different location. Sarah reached over and took his hand. Jack, it's been 6 years. Have you talked to anyone? A therapist, a counselor, anyone? No. Why not? Because talking about it makes it real. As long as I don't say it out loud, I can pretend she's just away somewhere, that she's going to come back. He wiped at his eyes roughly. I know that sounds crazy. It doesn't sound crazy. It sounds like grief. Sarah squeezed his hand. But you can't live like that forever. You're 48 years old. You've got a lot of life left, and Rebecca wouldn't want you to spend it hiding in the mountains. How do you know what she'd want? Because I knew her too. She was my friend before she was your wife, remember? And she loved you more than anything. She'd want you to be happy, to live, to find some kind of peace. Jackson stared out at the dark yard, watching fireflies blink in and out of existence. I don't know how to do that. Then we'll figure it out together. That's what family is for. Over the next few weeks, Jackson slowly adjusted to life in the suburbs. He helped Tom with projects around the house, teaching Michael how to use power tools and fix a leaking faucet. He took Emma to her volleyball practice and learned to make small talk with the other parents. He walked Ranger around the neighborhood every morning, gradually getting used to waving at joggers and dog walkers. But the media attention hadn't died down. If anything, it had intensified. News crews still called Sarah's house asking for interviews. Tabloids published wild stories about Jackson's past, most of them completely fabricated. One claimed he'd been a CIA operative. Another suggested he was in witness protection. A third insisted the whole treasure story was an elaborate hoax. David Rosen called regularly with updates on the legal proceedings. The FBI had finished cataloging everything from the cave. The bearer bonds had been authenticated. The gold had been moved to a secure federal facility. And the process of distributing funds to the victims' families was moving forward faster than expected. They're expediting everything, Rosen explained during one call. There's a lot of public pressure, and frankly, nobody wants to be responsible for 99-year-old Robert Torres dying before he gets his money. The first payments should go out within 3 months. That's good, Jackson said. There's something else. The town of Redstone has been getting inquiries from historians, documentarians, museums. Everyone wants to tell this story. There's talk of a book, maybe a movie. Jackson's stomach turned. I don't want any part of that. I figured you'd say that. But you should know, with or without your cooperation, people are going to tell this story. You might want some control over how it's told. I just want to be left alone. Then you shouldn't have found $300 million in stolen treasure, Rosen said dryly. Look, I'm not trying to pressure you. I'm just giving you the information. Think about it. Jackson hung up, feeling exhausted. He'd thought that doing the right thing would bring closure, peace, some sense of completion. Instead, it had turned his life into a media circus he couldn't escape. That evening, Sarah found him sitting in the garage, working on an old lawnmower engine that Tom had been meaning to fix for months. She sat down on a bucket beside him, watching as he cleaned the carburetor with practiced ease. "You're good at that," she observed. "I've had practice. 23 years as a mining engineer teaches you how to fix pretty much anything." "You miss it?" "Sometimes. Mostly I miss having a purpose. Up in the mountains, I told myself my purpose was survival. Keep the fire going, check the traps, fix whatever broke. But it was all just busy work to avoid thinking about what I'd lost." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "What if you went back to engineering?" "I'm 48. I've been out of the field for 6 years. Nobody's going to hire me." "Then don't get hired. Consult. Start your own business. Use that brain of yours for something more than fixing my husband's lawnmower." Jackson set down his tools and looked at her. "I wouldn't even know where to start." "So figure it out. You found a hidden cave in a blizzard and recovered a 47-year-old stolen fortune. I think you can handle updating your resume." Before Jackson could respond, his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Cole." A woman's voice, older, tentative. "My name is Margaret Hartley. Vincent Hartley was my uncle." Jackson sat up straighter. "Ma'am." "I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the FBI. I told them I needed to speak with you, and Agent Chen thought it would be all right." "What can I do for you?" Margaret took a shaky breath. "I wanted to apologize. For my uncle, for what he did, for the pain he caused. I was only 12 when he disappeared. My family never talked about it, but I knew. Everyone in town knew. We carried that shame for 47 years. "You don't have anything to apologize for," Jackson said gently. "You weren't responsible for his choices." "I know, but still, I needed to say it, and I needed to thank you." Her voice broke. "You could have kept that money. You could have walked away and let my uncle's crimes stay buried. But you didn't. You gave those families justice. You gave my family a chance to make amends, even though we can't bring Uncle Vincent back or undo what he did." Jackson didn't know what to say. Margaret continued. "The FBI returned his remains to us. We buried him last week in the family plot. There were protesters, people who wanted to dig him up and throw him in the trash. But there were also some of the victims' families who came. They didn't protest. They just stood there quietly. And afterward, one of them, an old woman with a walker, came up to me and said, 'He's at peace now, and so are we.'" "Dorothy," Jackson whispered. "You know her?" "Yes, ma'am. I know her." "She's remarkable. They all are. The grace they've shown, the forgiveness. It's more than my uncle deserved." They talked for another 20 minutes. Margaret told him about her uncle before the theft, how he'd been a good man once, how the pressure of running a failing company had changed him. She told him about the family's years of shame, the whispers, the judgment. And she told him that his decision to return the money had given them something they'd never expected: redemption. When he hung up, Sarah was still sitting on the bucket watching him. "Family of the man who stole the money?" she guessed. Jackson nodded. She wanted to apologize. That must have been hard for her. "I think it was harder for her uncle, dying alone with his guilt." Jackson stood up and stretched. "You know what's strange? Finding that cave didn't just change things for the victims. It changed things for everyone connected to the story. The families who lost money, the family of the man who stole it, even me." "How did it change you?" Jackson thought about that. "It reminded me that other people's pain matters, that the world doesn't stop just because you're hurting, and that sometimes doing the right thing isn't about what it costs you, it's about what it gives back to everyone else." 2 months after arriving in Kansas, Jackson got a call from Agent Chen. "Mr. Cole, I wanted to let you know that the first round of payments went out this morning. 83 families just received their restitution." Jackson's chest tightened. "All of them. All of them." We expedited the process as much as possible. Robert Torres got his check hand-delivered. He cried for 20 minutes. And Dorothy Finch. Her check was delivered this morning. She called our office to say thank you. She specifically asked me to thank you. After he hung up, Jackson sat on Sarah's couch for a long time, just processing. 83 families, lives changed, futures secured, all because he'd stumbled into a cave during a blizzard and decided to do what Vincent Hartley couldn't. That evening, his phone started buzzing with messages, texts from numbers he didn't recognize, all saying similar things. Thank you. You changed my life. God bless you. You're a hero. One message stood out. It was from a number with a Colorado area code. Mr. Cole, this is Patricia Torres, Robert's daughter. Dad passed away this morning, peacefully in his sleep. He got to hold that check in his hands and know that justice finally came. Thank you for giving him that before he left us. Jackson read the message 3 times, tears streaming down his face. Robert Torres had waited 47 years for justice, and he'd gotten it just in time. There was something profoundly right about that, something that made all the media attention and chaos worth it. Sarah found him crying in the kitchen and held him the way she used to when they were kids and the world felt too big. "I'm okay," he said. I'm okay." And for the first time in 6 years, he actually was. The following week, Jackson drove back to Redstone. He'd called ahead, told Dorothy he was coming, and asked if she wanted company. She'd invited him for tea, which felt very civilized for a man who'd spent the last 6 years drinking coffee out of tin cups. Her house was small, neat, filled with photographs and memories. She greeted him at the door with a smile that made her whole face light up. "Mr. Cole? Come in. I've made cookies." They sat in her living room, drinking tea from delicate china cups that looked like they'd been in her family for generations. Ranger lay at Jackson's feet, already charmed by Dorothy's gentle hands scratching his ears. "I got the check," Dorothy said. $3,400,000. Can you imagine? "What will you do with it?" "Well, first I'm going to fix the roof. It's been leaking for 5 years. Then I'm going to take my grandchildren on a vacation, somewhere warm with a beach. After that, I'll set up college funds for all of them. And then—" She paused, looking thoughtful. "Then I'm going to donate some of it to the food bank and the library and the community center, places that helped me when I had nothing." Jackson smiled. "That sounds perfect." "What about you?" Dorothy asked. "What will you do now?" "I'm not sure. I'm staying with my sister in Kansas for now, figuring things out." "Will you go back to the mountains?" Jackson shook his head. "No. I think I'm done hiding." "Good." Dorothy set down her teacup and looked at him with those sharp, kind eyes. "You know, when I first met you at Thompson's, I thought you were the saddest man I'd ever seen. You had this look about you, like you were already a ghost." "I felt like one. But not anymore. Now you look alive, tired, maybe a little overwhelmed, but alive." "I am alive," Jackson said. "I think I forgot that for a while." Dorothy reached over and patted his hand. "Well, don't forget it again. Life's too short and too precious to waste on hiding." They talked for 2 more hours, about everything and nothing. Dorothy told him stories about her husband Thomas, about the early days of their marriage, about the good years before Hartley's theft destroyed everything. She told him about rebuilding, about learning to be alone, about finding joy in small things when the big things were taken away. And Jackson told her about Rebecca, really told her for the first time in 6 years. He talked about how they met, about their wedding, about the 19 years they had together. He talked about the cancer, the treatments that didn't work, the moment she died holding his hand. And he talked about the guilt, the irrational but overwhelming guilt that somehow he should have saved her, should have done more, should have been better. Dorothy listened without interrupting, her eyes wet with tears. "You loved her," she said simply when he finished. "That's all any of us can do. Love the people we're given for as long as we're given them. You did that. You did everything right." Then why does it still hurt? Because love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes form. The hurt is proof you loved her. Don't run from that pain. It's the last connection you have to her. Jackson felt something shift inside his chest, like a weight he'd been carrying had finally found a place to rest. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For understanding. For not telling me to move on or get over it or find someone new. For just letting me miss her." Dorothy squeezed his hand. "You're going to be all right, Jackson Cole. It might take time, but you're going to be all right." When Jackson left Dorothy's house 2 hours later, he felt lighter than he had in years. He drove through Redstone slowly, looking at the town with new eyes. He saw the community center where the town hall had been held, the general store where he'd first met Dorothy, the mountains rising in the distance where a cave still held the memory of a man's final act of conscience. He stopped at the cemetery on his way out of town. It took him 20 minutes to find Robert Torres's grave, a fresh plot with a simple stone that read, "Robert Torres, 1924 to 2024, finally at peace." Someone had left flowers. Someone else had left a small American flag. And tucked against the headstone was a photograph of a young man in mining gear, grinning at the camera with the confidence of someone who thought he had his whole life ahead of him. Jackson stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, looking down at the grave of a man he'd never met, but had somehow helped in the last moments of his life. "I hope it was worth the wait," Jackson said quietly. "I hope 99 years was enough time to see justice done." The wind picked up, rustling through the grass, and Jackson imagined it was an answer. On the drive back to Kansas, Jackson made a decision. He pulled into a rest stop and called David Rosen. "I want to do the interviews," he said. "What changed your mind?" "I realize that this story isn't just about me. It's about the families who suffered, the justice that finally came, and the reminder that doing the right thing still matters. If telling my part helps spread that message, then I should tell it." Rosen was quiet for a moment. "All right, I'll set it up, but on your terms. You control which outlets, what questions they can ask, and when you're done, you're done. Deal?" "Deal." Over the next month, Jackson did exactly 3 interviews. One with a respected news program that focused on the families and their stories rather than sensationalizing the treasure. One with a documentary filmmaker who wanted to create a historical record of Hartley's theft and its resolution. And one with a small podcast run by a woman whose grandfather had worked for Hartley Mining. She wanted to tell the story for the descendants of the victims. Each interview was hard. Jackson wasn't a natural speaker, and he hated talking about himself. But he kept thinking about Dorothy and Robert and Margaret Hartley and all the people whose lives had been touched by that cave. He told their stories as much as his own. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from around the country, from people who'd been victims of fraud, from families dealing with unresolved crimes, from ordinary people who said Jackson's choice had restored their faith in humanity. Some sent money to set up a scholarship fund in Robert Torres's name. Others volunteered to help track down the remaining victims who hadn't been found yet. One letter came from a prison in Texas. It was from a man serving 20 years for embezzlement. He wrote, "I read about what you did. I read about Vincent Hartley dying with his guilt. I'm not getting out until I'm 63, but when I do, I'm going to spend the rest of my life paying back what I stole. You showed me it's never too late to try to make things right." Jackson taped that letter to Sarah's refrigerator. It stayed there for weeks, a reminder that even the hardest choices could ripple outward in ways you never expected. 3 months after the first payments went out, Agent Chen called with final news. "We found the last 12 families. Everyone's been accounted for. The final payments will go out next week, and then the case is officially closed." "All of them?" Jackson asked. "All of them. 140 victims or their descendants. Everyone gets their justice." Jackson closed his eyes, feeling something like completion settle over him. "What happens to the cave?" "It's been sealed. The state of Colorado is considering making it a historical site, but for now it's just closed off. Too dangerous for tourists, too significant to ignore." "Good." There's one more thing, Agent Chen said. The families have asked if you'd come to a memorial service they're planning. They want to honor Robert Torres and the others who died before seeing justice, and they want you there. Jackson didn't hesitate. I'll be there. The memorial was held in Redstone on a crisp October afternoon, the mountains painted gold and red with autumn colors. Over 200 people gathered in the town square, families of the victims, townspeople, officials, and media covering the event respectfully from a distance. A podium had been set up, and one by one people stood to share memories of loved ones who hadn't lived to see this day. They talked about fathers and mothers, grandparents and siblings, all of whom had been broken by Hartley's theft and never recovered. Patricia Torres spoke about her father, Robert, tears streaming down her face as she described how he'd held that check in his hospital bed and smiled for the first time in years. Marcus, the man whose parents had lost everything, talked about his mother teaching him that bitterness was a poison and that someday, somehow, things would be made right. And Dorothy Finch, standing with the help of her walker, told the story of her husband Thomas and how he'd died believing justice would never come. But it did come, she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. And we're all here today because one man chose integrity over wealth. That man reminded us that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear hiking boots and carry satellite phones into blizzards. The crowd laughed and cried at the same time. When it was Jackson's turn to speak, he stood at the podium feeling completely inadequate. What could he say that hadn't already been said? What words could possibly capture the weight of this moment? He looked out at the faces staring up at him, old and young, rich and poor, bound together by a shared history of loss and redemption. "I'm not good with words," he began. "I'm better with engines and mountain trails than speeches, but I want to say something about Vincent Hartley." The crowd stirred, surprised. He made a terrible choice. He stole from people who trusted him, and he destroyed lives. But in his final days, he tried to make it right. He left instructions to return the money. He died with regret and guilt and the desperate hope that someone would finish what he couldn't. Jackson paused. "I don't think we should forgive what he did. The damage was too great, the pain too deep. But I think we can acknowledge that he was human, broken and flawed and ultimately destroyed by his own choices. And I think we can choose to be better than he was, to face our mistakes instead of hiding from them, to do the right thing even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." He looked directly at Dorothy. "These families taught me that. They showed me what grace looks like, what forgiveness means, what it means to survive something terrible and still choose kindness. I found a cave full of treasure, but the real treasure was meeting all of you." The applause started slowly, then built until it filled the square. Jackson stepped down from the podium and was immediately surrounded by people hugging him, thanking him, telling him their stories. And for the first time since Rebecca died, Jackson felt like he was part of something bigger than his own grief. He felt connected, purposeful, alive. That night, Dorothy insisted he stay at her house rather than drive back to Kansas. They sat on her porch watching the stars come out over the mountains, drinking tea and listening to the wind. "What will you do now?" she asked. "I think I'm going to start living again," Jackson said. "Really living, not just surviving." "That sounds like a good plan." "What about you?" Dorothy smiled. "I'm going to take that vacation with my grandchildren, and then I'm going to volunteer at the library and the food bank. Keep busy, keep useful, keep remembering that I got a second chance and I shouldn't waste it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people who'd found each other through tragedy and come out the other side changed. "Thank you for stopping in that storm," Dorothy said quietly. "Thank you for finding that cave. Thank you for choosing us over yourself." Jackson shook his head. "I think you've got it backward. You all saved me. I was dying up in those mountains, just too stubborn to admit it. Finding that treasure forced me back into the world, back into life. So really I should be thanking you." Dorothy reached over and took his hand. "Then let's just say we saved each other. And sitting there on that porch, under stars that had witnessed both suffering and redemption, Jackson Cole finally understood what it meant to be home. Jackson woke up on Dorothy's couch the morning after the memorial service to the smell of coffee and bacon. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, and Ranger was already in the kitchen, his tail thumping hopefully against the linoleum floor. "I hope you're hungry," Dorothy called from the stove. "I made enough for a small army." They ate breakfast together at her small kitchen table, and Jackson realized this was what he'd been missing for 6 years. Not just food or shelter or even companionship, but the simple ritual of sharing a meal with someone who cared. Dorothy talked about her plans for the day, mentioned that her daughter was driving up from Denver for the weekend, and asked if Jackson would like to stay and meet her. "I should probably get back to Kansas," Jackson said. "My sister's expecting me." "Well, you're welcome here anytime. I mean that. You're family now." Jackson felt his throat tighten. "Thank you, Dorothy, for everything." As he loaded Ranger into his truck and prepared to leave Redstone, he took one last look at the mountains rising in the distance. Somewhere up there, sealed and silent, was the cave that had changed everything. He didn't need to see it again. He carried it with him now. Not the treasure, but the lesson it had taught him about what really mattered. The drive back to Kansas felt different this time. Lighter. Jackson found himself actually noticing things he'd driven past without seeing before. The way the morning light hit the plains, the small towns with their water towers and grain silos, the endless sky that seemed to promise something he couldn't quite name. When he pulled into Sarah's driveway, she came out to meet him with a look he recognized. It was the expression she used to wear when they were kids, and she had news she knew would change things. "What happened?" he asked. "You got a visitor while you were gone. Someone from Denver. He left his card and said he'd call back." She handed him a business card. Jackson read it twice. Marcus Chen, Director of Mountain Heritage Foundation, specializing in historical preservation and community development. Any idea what he wanted? He said something about a proposal, wouldn't give me details, said he needed to talk to you directly. Jackson pocketed the card and followed Sarah inside. Michael and Emma were at the kitchen table doing homework, and Tom was fixing something under the sink. It was so normal, so domestic, that Jackson felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Not jealousy exactly, but a kind of wistful recognition of the life he might have had if Rebecca had lived. That evening, Marcus Chen called. His voice was warm, professional, and direct. "Mr. Cole, thank you for taking my call. I'll get straight to the point. I represent a foundation that works to preserve historically significant sites and turn them into educational resources for communities. We've been following your story, and we'd like to discuss a potential project involving Redstone." "What kind of project?" "We want to create a museum and education center focused on the history of mining in Colorado, workers' rights, corporate responsibility, and the long-term impact of financial crimes on communities. We'd like to use the Hartley case as the central narrative, with your permission." Jackson was quiet for a moment. "I'm not interested in being part of a tourist attraction." "That's not what this would be. We're talking about a serious educational initiative. Programs for schools, resources for other communities dealing with similar issues, scholarship funds for the descendants of the victims. This wouldn't glorify treasure hunting or sensationalize the story. It would honor the families who suffered and teach the next generation about integrity, justice, and community resilience." "Why do you need me?" "Because you're part of the story, whether you like it or not. And because the families trust you. If you endorse this project, they'll support it. Without you, it's just another historical footnote." Jackson thought about Robert Torres and Dorothy Finch and all the others who'd waited 47 years for acknowledgement. "I need to think about it." "Of course. Take your time. But Mr. Cole, this could be your legacy. Not finding the treasure, but what you do with the story afterward." Over the next week, Jackson couldn't stop thinking about Marcus Chen's proposal. He called David Rosen to get his legal opinion, and Rosen was enthusiastic. "It's a good foundation," Rosen said. "I've worked with them before. They're legitimate, well-funded, and they actually care about the communities they work with. If you're going to have your story told anyway, and you are, this is probably the best way to control the narrative. Jackson also called Agent Chen at the FBI. She was more cautious, but ultimately supportive. "The case is closed from our end," she said. "What happens to the story now is up to you and the families. But I will say this. If someone's going to profit from this story, it should be the community that suffered. A museum and education center could provide jobs, bring revenue to Redstone, and actually do some good." Finally, Jackson called Dorothy. She answered on the second ring, sounding slightly out of breath. "Jackson, I was just thinking about you. How are you, dear?" "I'm good. Listen, I need your advice about something." He explained the museum proposal, and Dorothy listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a long pause. "What do you think the families would want?" Jackson asked. "I can't speak for everyone," Dorothy said slowly. "But I can tell you what Thomas would have wanted. He'd want people to remember what happened, to learn from it, to make sure it never happens again. He'd want his suffering to mean something." "So, you think I should do it?" "I think you should talk to the families, all of them. Get their input. If they support it, then yes, you should absolutely do it." So that's what Jackson did. Over the next 3 weeks, he made phone calls and sent emails to every family that had received restitution. He explained the proposal, answered questions, and listened to concerns. Some people were skeptical, some worried about privacy or exploitation. But slowly, a consensus emerged. 80% of the families supported the museum project, with specific conditions. The focus had to be on education rather than entertainment. The families would have input on the content and design. Any profits would go into a scholarship fund for Redstone students, and Jackson's role would be clearly explained, not as a hero seeking glory, but as a man who made a choice and honored it. Marcus Chen agreed to all the conditions. Within 2 months, preliminary plans were underway. The museum would be built on the site of the old Hartley mining office building, which had been abandoned since 1976. The cave itself would remain sealed, but there would be detailed recreations and virtual reality experiences that would allow visitors to understand what Jackson had found without disturbing the actual site. The project would take 3 years to complete, but the foundation had the funding and the expertise. They hired local contractors when possible, providing jobs for Redstone residents. They established the Robert Torres Memorial Scholarship Fund with an initial endowment of $5 million, and they asked Jackson to serve on the advisory board. "I'm not qualified for that," Jackson protested when Marcus Chen made the offer. "You're the most qualified person in the world for it. You found the treasure, you returned it, and you understand what this story means to the families. We need your voice at the table." Jackson reluctantly agreed on the condition that he wouldn't be the face of the project. "This isn't about me," he insisted. "It's about the families and the community." "Understood, but you get a say in how the story's told." As winter approached, Jackson found himself settling into a new rhythm. He spent 2 weeks a month in Kansas with Sarah's family, enjoying the strange comfort of suburban life and getting to know his nephew and niece again. Michael was applying to colleges and asked Jackson to help him with his engineering applications. Emma was dealing with typical teenage drama and somehow decided her uncle was the only adult she could talk to about it. The other 2 weeks he spent in Redstone, working with the museum project team and volunteering at the community center. He taught basic car maintenance classes to teenagers and helped seniors with home repairs. He wasn't getting paid much, but he didn't need much. His needs had become simple. He also started seeing a therapist, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Patricia Wallace, who specialized in grief counseling. The first session was brutal. Jackson sat in her office for 45 minutes, barely speaking. His defenses so high he could practically feel them radiating off his skin. "You don't have to talk today," Dr. Wallace said gently. "We can just sit here. I'm paying you to sit in silence. You're paying me to create a space where you can process your grief however you need to. If that means silence today, that's fine." By the third session, Jackson was talking. By the 6th, he was crying. By the 10th, he was beginning to understand that grief wasn't something you got over or moved past. It was something you learned to carry differently. Rebecca's death broke something fundamental in you, Dr. Wallace said during one session. But what you did with that brokenness is interesting. Most people either numb themselves or lash out at the world. You isolated yourself completely, which is its own form of self-destruction. But then you found that cave and suddenly you had a choice. Keep hiding or step back into life. You chose life. It didn't feel like a choice. It felt like there was only one right answer. That's what integrity is, when doing the right thing feels inevitable, not optional. She leaned forward slightly. The question now is, what kind of life are you stepping back into? Jackson didn't have an answer yet, but he was starting to figure it out. One cold evening in January, almost a year after he'd found the cave, Jackson got a call from an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Jackson Cole?" A woman's voice, younger, uncertain. "Yes? My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a teacher at Redstone Elementary. Dorothy Finch gave me your number. I hope that's okay." "It's fine. What can I do for you?" "I'm working with the Museum Foundation on developing curriculum for the Education Center, and I was hoping you might be willing to come speak to my 5th grade class. They're doing a unit on integrity and decision-making, and your story would be perfect." Jackson's immediate instinct was to say no. But then he thought about Emma and Michael, about the next generation trying to figure out how to navigate a complicated world. "What would you want me to talk about?" "Just tell them your story. How you found the cave, what you decided to do, and why. Kids need to hear that doing the right thing matters, even when it's hard." Jackson found himself in front of 28 5th graders on a Tuesday morning in February. They sat cross-legged on a carpet, looking up at him with the kind of unfiltered curiosity only children possess. One boy in the back was picking his nose. A girl in the front had a cast on her arm covered in signatures. "Hi," Jackson said awkwardly. "I'm Jackson Cole, and I'm not really good at this." The kids giggled. The teacher, Sarah Mitchell, smiled encouragingly from the side of the room. "So, about a year ago, I got caught in a blizzard." He told them the story, simplified for their age, but keeping the core truth intact. He talked about being scared and cold, about finding the cave by accident, about opening the vault and seeing all that treasure. He talked about Vincent Hartley and the choice he'd made that destroyed so many lives. "So I had to decide," Jackson said. "Keep the money and be rich, or give it back and do the right thing. Who thinks I should have kept it?" A few hands went up tentatively. "Why?" Jackson asked one boy. "Because you found it. Finders keepers." "That's fair. Who thinks I should have given it back?" More hands this time. "Why?" he asked a girl with braids. "Because it wasn't yours. It belonged to the people who worked for it." Jackson nodded. "That's exactly what I thought. And you know what? Giving that money back felt better than keeping it ever could have, because I can look at myself in the mirror and know I did the right thing." A small girl in the middle raised her hand. "Did you want to keep it? Even a little bit?" Jackson appreciated her honesty. "Yeah, I did. I'm not going to lie. I thought about what I could do with that much money. But then I read the journals and saw what keeping it had done to Mr. Hartley. It destroyed him. And I realized that being rich wasn't worth becoming someone I hated." Another hand. "What happened to the families who got the money back?" "A lot of them are doing really well. One lady named Dorothy, she's 97 now. She got to take her grandchildren on vacation for the first time. A man named Robert got to die knowing justice had finally been served. And a whole town got to remember that good people still exist." After his talk, the kids asked questions for 45 minutes. They wanted to know everything. What did the cave look like? Was he scared? Did he see any bears? What did the treasure smell like? How heavy was the gold? But the question that stuck with him came from a quiet boy who'd barely spoken the whole time. "Mr. Cole, after you gave the money back, were you happy?" Jackson thought about that, really thought about it. "You know what? I am happy. Not because of what I did, but because of who I met because of it. I met families who survived something terrible. I met people who showed me what forgiveness looks like. And I met myself again. The person I used to be before I got so lost in sadness that I forgot how to live. The boy nodded like he understood, and maybe he did. As Jackson left the school, Sarah Mitchell walked him to his truck. "That was perfect," she said. "The kids were completely engaged. Would you consider doing that regularly? Maybe once a month?" Jackson found himself saying yes before he'd really thought about it. And over the next few months, speaking to school children became one of his favorite things. He talked to elementary kids about integrity, to middle schoolers about dealing with loss, and to high schoolers about making hard choices. He wasn't polished or professional, but the kids responded to his honesty. Spring came to Colorado with wildflowers and snowmelt. The Museum Foundation broke ground on the Education Center in April, and half the town turned out for the ceremony. Jackson stood with Dorothy and the other families, watching as the first shovel of dirt was turned on a building that would ensure their story was never forgotten. Marcus Chen gave a speech about legacy and learning. The mayor of Redstone talked about economic revitalization and community pride. And then Dorothy, leaning heavily on her walker, stepped up to the microphone. "I've lived in this town for 74 years, she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I've seen the good times and the terrible times. I've watched families struggle and survive, and I never thought I'd live to see the day when our pain would be acknowledged, our losses restored, and our story told with dignity." She looked directly at Jackson. "That man there, he gave us that. Not just the money, but the hope that integrity still matters in this world. So this building we're creating isn't just a museum. It's a testament to what one person can do when they choose right over easy." The crowd applauded, and Jackson felt his face flush. He still wasn't comfortable with the attention, but he was learning to accept that this was part of the story now. After the ceremony, a woman approached him. She was in her early 40s with kind eyes and a tentative smile. A teenage boy stood beside her, lanky and awkward in the way of 15-year-olds everywhere. "Mr. Cole, I'm Sarah Bennett. I live here in Redstone. I've wanted to thank you for months, but I wasn't sure how to approach you." "You don't need to thank me," Jackson said automatically. "Actually, I do. See, my father worked for Hartley Mining. He died when I was 12, and my mom struggled for years. I grew up thinking the world was fundamentally unfair, that people like Hartley always won, and people like us always lost. Your choice to return that money, it changed how I see the world. It reminded me that good people exist." The teenage boy shuffled his feet. Sarah put her hand on his shoulder. "This is my son, Daniel. He's been following your story closely." Daniel looked up at Jackson with something like awe. "Mr. Cole, I'm doing a project for school about modern heroes. Can I interview you?" Jackson almost said no, but then he remembered the fifth graders and their honest questions. "Sure. What do you want to know?" They sat on a bench outside the construction site, and Daniel pulled out a worn notebook. His questions were thoughtful, probing. "What made you different from other people who might have kept the money? Did you ever regret your choice? What would you say to someone facing a similar ethical dilemma?" Jackson answered as honestly as he could, and when they were done, Daniel looked at him seriously. "My teacher said heroes are people who do extraordinary things. But I think you're a hero because you did an ordinary thing, the right thing, when everyone expected you not to." Jackson felt something shift in his chest. That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. As spring turned to summer, Jackson found himself thinking more about his future. He was 59 now, living between two places, doing work that mattered, but feeling like something was still missing. He talked about it with Dr. Wallace during one of their sessions. "What do you think is missing?" she asked. "I don't know. I have purpose now. I have people I care about. I'm not hiding anymore, but I still feel like I'm in transition, like I'm waiting for something to begin." "Maybe you're waiting for permission." "Permission for what?" "Permission to be fully alive again, to want things, to dream, to love." Jackson was quiet for a long time. I don't know if I can love anyone that way again. Rebecca was it for me. Rebecca was your first great love. That doesn't mean she has to be your only love. You're 49 years old, Jackson. You could have another 40 years ahead of you. Are you really going to spend them alone out of loyalty to someone who would want you to be happy? The question haunted him for weeks. He thought about Rebecca constantly, trying to imagine what she would say, and he kept coming back to one memory, a conversation they'd had a year before she died, when she was sick but still fighting. "If something happens to me," she'd said, "I want you to promise me something. Nothing's going to happen to you. Jackson, promise me you'll keep living, that you'll find someone who makes you happy, that you won't turn into one of those widowers who just exists until they die." He'd promised, but he hadn't meant it. He'd thought it was just talk, the kind of thing people say when they're scared. Now he wondered if she'd known better than he did what he'd need to hear. In August, the Museum Foundation hosted a fundraising dinner in Denver. Jackson attended reluctantly, uncomfortable in the suit Sarah had forced him to buy. He sat at a table with Dorothy, Marcus Chen, and several other project board members, picking at salmon and making awkward small talk. That's when he met Catherine Warren. She was in her mid-40s, with silver streaking through dark hair and laugh lines that suggested someone who smiled often. She was introduced as the Foundation's new director of programming, hired to develop the educational curriculum for the museum. "So you're the famous Jackson Cole," she said, shaking his hand. "I'm not famous, just notorious." She laughed, and Jackson found himself wanting to make her laugh again. They ended up talking through the entire dinner, barely touching their food. Catherine told him about her background in education, about her work developing programs for museums across the country, about her passion for making history accessible and relevant to young people. "The Hartley story is perfect for that," she said. "It's got everything: crime, redemption, moral complexity, real human impact. Kids can understand it on their level, and adults can appreciate the deeper implications. Just don't make me the hero of the story," Jackson said. "I'm just the guy who stumbled into it." That's exactly what makes you compelling. You're not some larger-than-life figure. You're a regular person who made an extraordinary choice. That's more powerful than any superhero story. They exchanged numbers, and over the next few months they talked regularly about the museum project. But the conversations gradually expanded beyond work. They talked about books, about loss. Catherine was divorced, had raised 2 kids mostly alone, about what it meant to start over in middle age. It wasn't romance, not at first. It was friendship, the kind that sneaks up on you and becomes essential before you realize it's happening. One evening in October, Catherine called him. "I'm driving through Kansas on my way to a conference in St. Louis. Any chance you'd want to get coffee?" Jackson met her at a diner outside Wichita. They sat in a booth for 4 hours, talking and laughing. And when they finally left, Jackson walked her to her car in the parking lot. "This was nice," Catherine said. "We should do it again." "I'd like that." She started to get in her car, then turned back. "Jackson, can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." "Are you ever going to let yourself be happy again? Really happy?" The question caught him off guard. "I'm working on it." "Good, because you deserve it, and I think your wife would want it for you." She drove away, and Jackson stood in the parking lot for a long time, thinking about happiness and permission and what it meant to honor the dead by living well. By the time winter arrived again, almost 2 years after finding the cave, Jackson had made another decision. He sold his cabin in the mountains. It had been empty since he'd left anyway, and bought a small house in Redstone. Not a big place, just 3 bedrooms and a garage where he could work on engines. But it was his, and it was in the community he'd become part of. Dorothy cried when he told her. "You're staying?" "I'm staying. This is home now." Sarah and her family visited for Thanksgiving, and Jackson hosted dinner in his new house. It was chaotic and loud, with Michael and Emma fighting over the remote and Tom burning the rolls, but it was perfect. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Jackson stepped out onto his porch. The mountains rose dark against the stars, and somewhere up there, the cave sat silent and sealed. He thought about Vincent Hartley, about the choice that had destroyed one man and saved dozens of families. He thought about Rebecca and the life they'd had, and the life he was building without her. And he thought about second chances, how rare they were, how precious, how easy to waste if you weren't paying attention. His phone buzzed. A text from Catherine. "Happy Thanksgiving. Grateful for your friendship and excited about the museum opening next year. Hope you're surrounded by people you love." Jackson smiled and texted back, "I am. Thank you." The Museum and Education Center opened in June of the following year, 3 years and 4 months after Jackson had found the cave. The ceremony was massive, with news crews from across the country, politicians giving speeches, and hundreds of people touring the new facility. But the moment that mattered most to Jackson came later, after the crowds had thinned. He stood in the main exhibition hall with Dorothy, now 98, and still fierce despite needing a wheelchair. They looked at a wall covered with photographs of the victims and their families. "They're all here," Dorothy whispered. "Everyone who suffered, everyone who survived. Their stories matter now." "They always mattered," Jackson said. "Yes, but now the world knows it." In the center of the exhibition was a recreation of the cave vault, complete with replica gold bars and historical context about mining pensions and corporate fraud. But the real centerpiece was simpler. Vincent Hartley's journal, displayed in a climate-controlled case, open to his final entry. Visitors could read his words, "Do what I couldn't, give it back." And below that, a plaque that read, "Jackson Cole found this journal and honored its final request. In doing so, he reminded us that integrity is not about grand gestures, but about choosing right over easy, even when no one is watching." Jackson stood in front of that plaque for a long time, thinking about the journey that had led him here. From a man hiding in the mountains, drowning in grief and isolation, to someone who'd found purpose in the most unexpected place. Catherine found him there, touched his arm gently. "You okay?" "Yeah, just thinking about how strange life is. 2.5 years ago, I was trying to freeze to death in a blizzard. Now I'm standing in a museum dedicated to what I found in that storm." "You're not just standing in it. You helped build it. You made sure these families' stories would be told with dignity." "We made sure," Jackson corrected. "This wasn't just me." She smiled. "You're going to have to get better at accepting credit." "I'll work on it." That evening, there was a private reception for the families and project team. Jackson found himself standing with Dorothy, Marcus Chen, Sarah Mitchell, the teacher, Daniel Bennett, now 17 and volunteering at the museum, and dozens of others who'd become part of this extended family. The mayor raised a glass. "To Jackson Cole, who proved that one person really can make a difference." "To the families," Jackson countered, raising his own glass, "who showed me what resilience looks like." They drank together, and in that moment, Jackson understood something fundamental. He hadn't saved these people. They'd saved each other, and in the process, they'd saved him too. Later, as the party wound down, Jackson walked outside into the cool evening air. The town of Redstone spread out before him, lights twinkling in windows, the mountains dark silhouettes against the stars. He thought about the cave up there, about the fortune that had waited 47 years to be found, about the man who'd died with his guilt. But mostly he thought about choices, the ones we make in moments of crisis, the ones that define us when no one else is watching, the ones that ripple outward in ways we never expect. His phone buzzed. A text from Catherine. "Heading home. Great event. Dinner this week?" Jackson smiled and typed back, "It's a date," because that's what second chances looked like. Not dramatic revelations or sudden transformations, but small moments of courage strung together. Coffee that turns into friendship. Friendship that might become something more. A museum that honors the past while building the future. A man who'd been broken learning how to be whole again. Jackson Cole had found $347 million in a frozen cave during a blizzard. But the real treasure wasn't gold or bonds or rare currency. It was this, a community restored, families healed, a town revived, and a lonely man who'd remembered how to be part of the world again. He'd spent 6 years running from pain. He'd spent the last 2.5 years learning to run towards something better. And standing there in Redstone, under stars that had witnessed both suffering and redemption, Jackson finally understood what Dorothy had tried to tell him all along. The money was never the miracle. The miracle was what happened when one person chose integrity over wealth, community over isolation, and courage over fear. The miracle was remembering that we're all connected, that our choices matter, that doing the right thing, even when it costs us everything, is its own reward. Because anyone can find treasure if they're lucky enough to stumble into the right cave. But it takes real courage to give it back, to trust that there are things more valuable than gold, to believe that integrity matters even in a world that often suggests otherwise. Jackson looked up at the mountains one more time, then turned back toward the museum where lights still glowed warm against the darkness. Inside, people were laughing, sharing stories, building something that would outlast all of them. He'd come to these mountains to die slowly, to hide from a pain too big to face. Instead, he'd found a way to live again. Not the same life he'd had before. That was gone, and mourning it was right and necessary. But a new life, built on the foundation of a choice made in a frozen cave when the easiest thing would have been to walk away. And as Jackson headed back inside, toward the warmth and the people and the future that was still being written, he realized something that would have surprised the man he'd been 2.5 years ago. He was happy, not perfectly, not without moments of grief and loneliness, but genuinely, truly happy. Because he'd learned that happiness isn't about having everything you want. It's about being able to look at yourself in the mirror and recognize the person staring back. The mountain man who'd entered an ice-filled cave during a storm had found more than $300 million. He'd found his way home. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe integrity still matters in this world.